Hi, I'm Lars. Welcome back to the C# workshop. In this video, I'll cover how to build a web service that uses serialization, JavaScript object notation, or JSON, and how cool .NET has all of this built into the framework, and how .NET does this better than any other language. This is a very long video, but I believe it'll be a great reference for web services, so please like and subscribe to the channel. So let's get to it. When I talk to most people about web services and how they're set up, multi-tiers, this is what they think about. They think that a channel has a user interface. For the number one part here, it might create a web API backend, or the interface might talk directly to a web service. And then that web API talks to an API, and then that API talks to a web service for the backend, and that talks to API for the repository. That's not exactly true. So this is more of a realistic kind of diagram. User interfaces do talk to some sort of service on the back end. It could be a web service, and this is a very standard architecture. The middle tier, this web API or API will call a web API that is what I like to look at as being attached to an API. And then that API calls another web API that is attached to an API for the repository. Now, as you can see, you could have multiple web APIs attached to the same API, and that would allow you to share different things with different people or have different securities on them. But for the most part, you're going to end up seeing something that looks like this, and it is just another API that would have a web API attached to it. What we're going to be looking at is a channel that has the web API, and that is going to be talking to a middle tier web API, and the actual logic will be in an API project. Now, I know this is all kind of a little bit confusing. You might want to rewatch this section again, but in a nutshell, this is what we're looking at. We're going to have a web service on the middle tier, and it's going to be called Web API Customer. And then it's going to have a controller and a method. And in the API logic, you're going to have something that's called an API Customer. Not a web API, but an API Customer. These two have a symbiotic relationship. And the API Customer has a class and a method, much like the Web API has a controller method. It's that the Web API's method will call into the API's method to actually perform the logic. And these are a little bit more detailed, where your controller will be called Customer Controller, and it'll have a method called retrieve by ID. And then inside of the API, you'll have a class called Customer, and it will also have a method called retrieve by ID. So at this point in time, I want to get into the code and start building up these projects and explain how these projects go together. I'm not going into total detail. I've already reviewed this in a few other videos, and I'll reference those videos down below in the description, and I will also comment on where this information is at when we get to it. First thing that we need to do is we need to create a core web API. So we're going to click on that, go to next. So we're going to drop in here the name. The name is made up of nodes. Every dot is a node. So TDC is a node, Lars Workshop's a node. So TDC is the name of our company, Thurman Design Company. Lars C# Workshop is the project. Web API is the type of project that we're creating, not the actual project. Like in a business point of view, it's a project. This is the actual project. This is the specificity of the project. This is dealing with customers. We're going to put this into the middle tier, and we're going to hit next. I don't care if you configure for HTTPS. We don't need it, but I'm going to leave it there. Enable open API support. This is all fine, and then we're going to do a create. Now, this is the structure, the file structure behind. There's some stuff in system that we're going to bring in, not all of it, and then there's middle tier. And this is what your folder structure will look like. It does have the solution inside of the structure here, and that's okay. That's what is open right now. Now, eventually, we will bring another solution on the outside here later on down in the video if we get down to that point. The first thing I'd want to do is I want to come over here to Web API and go down to Properties. This is a bug that when they pulled out Swagger, it kind of got added in. So the URL, the address to navigate to, this should be openapi/v1.json. If you don't do that, somewhere in the code, it's hard coded to go to Swagger. I do not know why. Swagger is not being used anymore, and I do know why about that. It's because of all the CVEs. If you don't know what a CVE is, it's a common vulnerability and exploitation, and that means that your code can be hacked. Your application will be hacked very easily if somebody gets to it. Now, so I usually put that in for HTTP and HTTPS. After we get the URL set to Open API, make sure you click on Launch Browser. And then you can close this down. Something else that I do is if you go to Properties here, into Launch Settings, you're going to see Application URL is something kind of goofy. But we're going to change this around to make this for HTTP, because you're going to be normally coming in on a port 80. So I'm going to put a 21 in front of it. And I'm going to put this down here too. And then this one here is going to be 4321, because normally you come in on port 443. All right. So this just keeps it easier to, when you look at that 8021, you're going to know that this is HTTP instead of looking for this little S. Okay. It also will help later when we start doing some HTTP configuration. And now when we run this, you're going to see a browser pop up. And it's just going to have your API listed out in it. This is similar to Swagger, and I know a lot of people out there are Swagger heads. To be honest with you, I don't use Swagger, and I've never have used Swagger. And as you come through these classes and stuff, you'll understand that using Swagger for your testing is a lot of manual intervention. Okay, so you might as well start building up your test without Swagger. This way you'll be able to get to stuff. Now I'm going to resize this so it fits in my screen. This will show you that there is a path of weather forecast, and it's on local 8021. First thing I do when I'm starting for all the projects is I remove the nullable, enable, and implicit usings. Nullable enable says that you got to put a question mark after every reference type, and that's for AI, so AI can find that and pick it up. Well, I'm sorry, but I'm not programming for AI, I'm programming for myself, and that's just kind of annoying that I got to put an extra step in for AI. Secondly, all this stuff here with like API controller and whatnot, if you don't know where it's coming from, then how do you code for it? Okay, so that's the other reason that I take out the implicit usings. Like this here is using system. You go to program, and I've already put these in here for it because we're going to delete this controller and this weather forecast. Now, this is a clean project at this moment. If we were to build this, nothing's going to fail. Everything succeeded. But remember, in our diagram, we had a web API and we had an API. So we need to add another project. This is going to be a new project again, but this one's going to be a class library. And we use the term API because we've used it for 50 years now. It's an application programming interface. So this is going to be a symbiotic relationship with this web API. And we're going to drop it in. So if we go back to the file structure, inside of the middle tier, you're going to see there's going to be a web API customer and an API customer. These two are tightly related. Okay, the only one that you can execute is a web API, so it's the only one that needs a solution file, the actual solution. And there's it right here. The class, again, this is another one of those things we just don't need. We're going to go into the project. We're going to delete these guys out. I'm going to do a quick build, and everything succeeded. Hey, if you think there's too much information to remember, then like and subscribe to the channel. Then you'll have a URL that you can go back and look at anytime. While everything is empty, every web API needs to have a couple packages in it. So I'm going to right click here on packages and go to manage NuGet packages. And it's going to tell me everything installed, which is right. There's the open API. So we're going to go to browse. The first thing we need to look for here in browse is ASP.versioning. And this drop down here will just keep everything you've ever searched for. So try to spell stuff correctly, otherwise you'll be looking for stuff that you don't really want. We need this ASP versioning HTTP. You're going to click install, and we're going to pull that down. ASP versioning MVC API Explorer. We're going to pull that down. That is it. So you need these three guys here. Now, we also need to include in the solution, we're going to add an existing project. And this is the directory that we've been in. I'm going to go into System, and we're going to take the project for Common. Now, I'm not going to get into a lot of what's going on here in Common, but I will tell you that there is an operational data space. Lars C# Workshop is actually my database for this project. Inside of it, we have customer, we have a product, and we have a user. Under security, we'll get to security later in this video. This is also where the serialization sets. Okay, in the other videos, I had this sitting in a serialization project, but this is where I normally keep it because this is what I'm serializing. This is what I call the 6 usual suspects. There's the create date time, create user, update user, delete date time, and delete user ID. Just the way it is. That is something else that both of these are going to need. So here's the dependencies. We're going to add a project reference, and we're going to add API common and API customer to the web API customer. And under customer, we're going to add API common. So the next part of this, we need to add a couple directories in here. And the directories that we're going to add are going to match what we have up here, operational Lars Workshop. This is going to be a little strange for a lot of people, but just kind of roll with me on it. So here's operational, and then we're going to add a new folder here. We're going to call this Lars Workshop because this is the database, C# Workshop. This is the database where everything's coming out of. And I'm going to take this and I'm going to do a quick copy since it's empty. I'm going to go down to controller and I'm going to paste this in here too. So we keep the structure and I don't have to retype it all. Now, I'm going to add a class into here, and we're going to call this class customer. And inside of customer, we're going to place a couple methods and a constructor. So there's a constructor, and then here's a couple methods. One will be retrieving the customer by ID, and the other one will be retrieving the customer by email and password. Email address and password. This is just simulations calling a database is all they are. They're just going to basically return the same thing. So now that we have the customer built up, remember, this is what the API is going to call into. So we're going to come here, we're going to put an add in, we're going to add a controller. It's going to be MVC empty, and then you're just going to name this customer controller. All controllers need to have the word controller at the end. In order for them to work. We're also going to inherit from controller base instead of controller. So as you see, this is a base class for MCC controller without view support. And this one here is with view support. We don't want the view support. So inside of the custom controller, I'm going to add a constructor and a method. The method is coming in. It's called retrieve by ID. And I know it's a post. Everyone's going to be like, oh, it's a retrieve. It's got to be a get. There's a reason I use posts for my gets, and the reason is because a URL can only have 2,048 characters. This guy right here, this convert unit to unit ID user identity name, this is going to be something we're going to just pull out of here temporarily. And I'm going to go like that, and we're just going to comment that out for a moment. And we'll get back to that later. So what this does, it creates an API customer, the API customer operational C# Workshop. This is this guy right here, this customer class, and we call this retrieve by ID. So now if we go back here, you'll see everything's good. We do a build, everything looks great. So let me hit F5. We're going to run this. Now this is your open API. Now what do we see here? We see we got the URL HTTP localhost 8021. That's good. 8021. There's no paths. There's no components. So there's a problem. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is because this is the number one issue that always comes up whenever I have somebody working with me that is a junior developer, and they're like, I don't know what's going on. And that's okay. So what we need to do is you need to put in here API controller. Now the system knows that this is an API controller. So now when we run it, now it's a little different, right? You got a whole bunch of stuff going on here. Here's all your components. You got user, first name, right? So that's a bunch of stuff there. And you've got a path of retrieve by ID. Notice this doesn't say, remember before we had the get weather forecast, and this said retrieve by ID. And so this is kind of like, what if I put another controller in here and we have, it just has a retrieve by ID. So if we created another controller and we had a retrieve by ID, we're going to have a problem. Now, I don't care where you put this controller. You put this controller here and you say add controller, right? We're just going to call this, test controller. And we're going to do the same thing that we did on the other side. We're going to throw at the top here, API controller. And I'm just going to copy this out of here like this. And we're going to drop a paste in here. Click, click. Everything else can be the same. Doesn't really matter. And now I'm going to run it. Well, now you got a retrieve by ID, and you still only have one. Okay, it's because you can only have one retrieve by ID. If I switch this to a number 2, now you got retrieve by ID 2 and retrieve by ID. But we don't want to go around with just retrieve by ID 2. And what if I move this again? So there's a way to fix this, and that would be, you could put in here test like that, and then I can come over here to the customer and say customer and put a slash in there like that. And now we can run it. Now it makes a little more sense. I spelled customer wrong, but this is just an example. So now you got test retrieve by ID, and that makes better. And this is customer retrieve ID, even though it's spelt wrong. But that does prove a point, this next point that I'm going to put in here. I know customer is sitting like this. So there's something called a route system. If we go over here to customer, right underneath controller, and you put in route controller, you can take out customer here. You go to test, you put that in, and we've already took out test from there. And then we run this. Now you'll end up with test retrieve by ID and customer retrieve by ID. And it's spelt the same way as the customer controller is. So that works pretty good. Okay. And we're going to be updating this route here in a little bit later. But I'm going to get rid of the test controller. We don't need it. I don't want everyone to get confused with it. So we're just going to get rid of it. But the customer controller setting here, now we get our nice customer controller. We can use request by ID wherever we want, and everything's good. What I want to talk about now is API versioning. And API versioning is extremely important if you're writing APIs, especially if you have external vendors that are calling in to try to get your information, or just people in other departments. So you need to know about API versioning. And the way we do this is we put API version 1 in here. Now you can put anything in here you really want. It's a string. So as long as they use those numbers, you'll be able to call it. The second thing is you're going to put API. This is what I do. And I say with a V, and then I use my little curly braces, and I say version API version curly brace a whack. And I will put this in. Now when we run this, watch what happens. You're going to get this, oh, wow, API version wasn't there, right? Doesn't know what to do with it. And that's true, because over here in program, we need to add the code for API versioning. And it's just a little builder service stuff. So where you put this at is right after the controllers, is where I usually put it. We're going to add API versioning. And it's going to give me the default is 1.0. Assume default versioning when unspecified. Report API versions, and then you're going to have, I'm going to scoot this back out here a little bit. We're going to add the API Explorer. Remember, we put these two things in here as dependencies, right? Versioning and API Explorer. So this is going to group this to a version and then 3 uppers and substitute API version. Now, when we run it now, see a little bit different output. Look at that. Now we have a path that has API version 1, customer retrieve by ID. What does the app version help you out with? Well, if you need to make an entire new controller, you can't call it custom controller. You'd have to call it custom v2 or something like that. And it would have to be a copy of this file. More than likely what you're going to do is you're going to end up adding another version here, say app version 2, because you're going to be updating this method. Now, as soon as you put this in here, you're going to see retrieve by ID cannot be used. So that's when you would come back and switch this to version 1, like, v1, and you would put a v2 on this. Don't just make it this one V2. If you're going to do this, make sure you do a V1 and a V2. These can stay the same. Okay. Now it's going to tell you there's a conflict here, but that's okay because we're going to come in here and say map to API version 1. And the one down here at the bottom, you're going to say map to API version 2. Just for grins and giggles, we're going to put in here customer dot sequence is equal to 1. And customer dot sequence over here, we're just going to make it equal to 2. Nothing major. We're going to build it and we're going to start it. But we're going to take a different route this time because just seeing the website, you're not going to see this up here. Okay, if you look at this, the OpenAI, you're not going to have the option to be able to run this. This is just displaying what you have. So it's going to say customer retrieve ID, and you're not going to see version 2. So what we need to do is there's a little file here down at the bottom called customer HTTP. It's all built into the web API. And what this allows you to do is, if, say we're running this for just version 1, we can hit send request and you'll get that back. And you'll see here that the little update that we did with sequence 1 is sitting there. This is how you put in your data. You say content type application JSON, you put your JSON in here that you're sending in. Since it's a post, we're taking it from the body, we're not adding it at the end as a query string. So to do version 2, all you need to do is flip this to version 2, and then you can send that request. Now this proves to you that this is the way it works when a channel is calling in, and this is the benefit of having versioning. The next thing we need to do is we need to create a console application or a channel to simulate a web API or an API calling into this web API. So we're just going to call it console application, and this guy is going to be named, and we're going to name this guy workshop.channel. Now this is not going to go in the middle tier directory. We're going to put this in another directory, and it's going to be called or channel. Then we hit next, 9.0, and we do a create. Okay, so now that we have our channel, we need to add a couple other projects. And one of the projects is going to be the common, because we need to add stuff to it. We need to be able to send stuff in. And the other is going to be the configuration. We need to add these two projects to the channel, so we're going to add these project references, common and configuration. And we're going to do a quick little build, make sure everything's still there and working. Oh, we got something that failed. Name console does not exist, and that's fine. So we need to add system in. And that'll be the first thing that we have to add in. There'll be more. All right, now I need to put in here, we're going to create a worker class. We're going to add a class, and it's going to be named worker. And this is kind of my trademark, if you will. I always create a worker class to do all my work. It's going to inherit from a background service because we're going to make this a hosted service. And of course, we're going to get the implement abstract class. So I'm going to go over and drop this code in because I really don't think everybody wants to see me just copy and pasting everything in. Now that this is posted in here, the background service allows us to host this inside of the program. We have a couple things that are dependency injected. If you want to know more about how to dependency inject, go check the dependency injection video. But basically, these will come in without me sending them in through this being a hosted service. And we need an application lifetime that allows us to stop this execution of this service once it's done. This being the worker class is the class that everything's going to do work on. We have inherited from background service all of this stuff that's at the top with the host application lifetime and this is stop application. Why this is here is in the configuration file video. The main things that we're looking at, this here is all new. This is specific to creating a web service. The post async calls out to setup right here. It calls out to the create byte array content, and it calls out to, and setup calls out to get address space. I'll step through every spot once we get this thing up and running. So what we're going to do is we're going to call into this retrieve customer by ID, which is going to take an ID in. Now, I'm just sending in 1, 2, 3, 4. It doesn't really matter what we send in because I've got all this hard coded on the middle tier. This is just testing the jump over to the middle tier and coming back. But we will put this in because this is what it's going to require later. We're going to serialize the payload down. If you look at the serialization video, this will explain more about how this works. But basically, you're taking an object down to a string or a JSON string. And then we're going to put that, we're going to use the client setting, and we're going to send this to the post async. So we're sending in the controller as customer. The method we're calling is retrieve by ID. We've got our JSON payload. We don't have any authentication yet. So in order to run this now, we need to build up our program file. All right, so we need to put some things here in the program file because we're going to have to read out of the app settings.json. So before we start, I'm just going to get rid of the console, but before we go anywhere, let's add in a JSON file. So the way we do is we add a new item. It is actually not named app settings JSON. It's just going to be a JSON file. So we're just typing here app settings. Why? Because this is a standard for .NET. And then you're going to get this couple of things of exclude here, and we're going to put a comma after this, and then we're going to drop in a couple other things. Well, we're going to drop in this client config, the HTTP config. I'm going to ignore this one at the moment, and we're going to ignore this one. But this is what we're doing. So we're calling into localhost. We're not giving it a service. We're not giving it a grouping. We're going to call customer, and it's on port 8021. So this is why I said it's very important to have 8021, 4321, or whatever other port you're having. As you notice when we get to authentication, this is going to be 8042 and 4342. All right. So it just, if you keep these tracked, keep them in a Excel spreadsheet or something, it'll make your life easier. Now, if we go back to program, in order to read from this file, we need to have a configuration. So there's an I configuration, and this will read this entire configuration as long as you give it the proper file name. The base directory is going to be where this file is at. Now, if you do not do this step, where you say copy to output directory, you're going to crash. So just say copy if newer. Now that will put it out into your bin directory or wherever your directory needs to be. So I'm just going to put in the console.readline here, like that, and we'll put a breakpoint, and we're going to run this. The program file is the first thing that runs. Nothing else is going to run but here. We're going to stop right after this. So the configuration picked up all the excludes and all of your HTTP client configs. Everything is in here that you need. How do we get that information back to the other side? How do we get it here to worker? Well, that's all part of dependency injection. And so we need to have one of these guys available, okay, to get it in there. So in order to do that, we need to create something called a host builder. Now, this is the way, if you guys mess with your services and stuff, you will see that there's a web builder and all this stuff is already available for you. The big thing is that you don't have that available in a console app until you start hosting a service. This is why we're hosting the service and its worker. So we're going to add a singleton in, which is the iHTTP client config, HTTP config, and then this is going to call the load up here in configuration for this config. Notice that we have a note here, section get requires Microsoft Extensions hosting. So this is going to go to the config section. It's going to pull out HTTP client config, and then within the section, you're going to tell it, give me this class. All right, that's all this is going on. But you need extensions hosting for this. You're not going to see anything here. The next thing is we want to get rid of the console read line. In order to do that, you need to paste this in. This will build the builder, and then it will run the host, which is worker, which is here. All right, so let's kick this thing off and see what it does. All right, so what we're going to do is the channel I'm going to leave over here on the left-hand side, and you'll see in a second. But I'm going to be able to zoom in and out on this, but I switched the resolution of my screens to 4K. So I'm just going to close this down so that you can see the channel on one side, and you're going to see the middle tier web API customer on the other. So let's just put a breakpoint here in the controller. We're going to put one on the constructor, and we're going to put one on the actual method that we're calling. And I'm just going to minimize the comments at the bottom. On this side, we're going to go to worker, and we're going to put a breakpoint here on line 33. Now, in order for this to call over to make the jump from channel to the middle tier, we need to have the middle tier running. So we need to kick that off. You'll moves the stuff over to the left-hand side. You'll see that you'll get a web page up. If you're not getting a web page up, then that means something's wrong with the middle tier. Secondly, when we start this guy up, you should come straight down to execute async. First thing we're going to do is we're going to call this retrieve customer by ID. The number going in is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's just fictitious. And it's going to step down into this method. We're going to load up the customer, and then we're going to take that object and we're going to serialize it into JSON, and it looks like this. It's just JSON. Then we're going to send this into the post async. The first thing we call is the create byte array content. What that does is it takes your payload, which is a JSON string, and it creates it into a list of numbers or bytes. It just makes it go across the wire a lot easier. Then we call into setup, and I'm going to back up here to setup so we can actually step into it. Setup looks in the HTTP client config that was sent in using dependency injection up here at the top. So there's 3 of them that are here. We're looking for the second one. We're not using product or authentication, so we're going to see, with giving the controller name, we end up with customer back. We're going to get our HTTP port, HTTPS port, the timeout, the URL is built up between HTTP, because you're saying use HTTPS is false. It's going to be HTTP, localhost, something with customer, and then the port. So since we have something, we're going to get the base address. All this does is just those things I just mentioned, it assembles them for you to HTTP, localhost 8021, API v1. All right. And that's what you need over here is API v1 controller. The controller part will come back and it will come through in a second. We need to create an HTTP client. It is the standard way of calling across the internet to another service or marshaling an object or anything to that effect. HTTP client is the easiest and cleanest way to do it. The timeout is whatever you set in the app settings. Since I didn't set it, the default that I have it set to is 2 seconds. We're going to create a new base address. We have to give that to a URI, so that's the base address. If we have any authentication, which we don't, we would have put that on the default headers. And then we're going to return out of here the URL. And that's what our URL looks like now. So it's whatever we had in app settings, it's just assembled. That's all that did. Okay. So the next thing is we're going to get into post async, which you can't get into it. You're just going to call it. And then the wait will tell it to wait till it gets over to the other side. Since this jumped up like this is what we call it a jump because it jumps forward or jumps over, however you want to look at it. We ended up in the middle tier. Now, if you've never done this before, this is kind of exciting. And it's really exciting when you have 3 to 4 to 5 of these things and you can see it go back and forth across multiple screens. What will always happen whenever a method is called, you have to instantiate this controller. So that's why the constructor is being called. So there's a lot of stuff you can put into a controller if you're looking to get how many counts you're doing or stuff like that. The next thing we do is I'm just going to hit F5 because it's just going to roll through and line up all the properties, is we end up calling retrieve by ID. Now, one thing that I'm going to open this up. One thing that I want to show everybody is we sent that customer ID over in a string. .NET framework has serialization built into the framework. That's why it's so secure. Okay, that's why serialization in .NET is secure. So if you look at the customer here, it's an object, and it has the customer ID in it. The reason is when we said, hey, we're bringing this from the body, we know it's coming in from JSON. Just let .NET and the framework deserialize it for you. You don't need to deserialize it. So the next part of this is we're going to come down here and we're going to create this object over here on the API customer. Remember, it's the back end object that we've been, I told you about earlier. So that creates it, and then this calls the tree by ID in it. This here I just forgot to take out. Doesn't really mean anything. So now we end up in the customer on the back end, the API retrieve by ID. I'm going to set all these values. I'm going to come back to this point right here, and then I don't have a breakpoint sitting over here, so I'm going to put one in after the call to this post. So right there. Then we can come back over to the customer. So if I'm setting these two side by side, I'm just popping back and forth between the two of these guys, okay? Scoot this guy over so you can see the jump. I'm going to hit F5 to do this because I don't want to hit all the sets and everything. So then we come right back to the spot. Otherwise, this would sit here with this wait for 2 minutes because that's the timeout. It was successful. We're going to read as string. If this was not successful, you get one of these other errors down here. So I'm just going to hit F5 so we can get back up to here. So let's take a look at this result one. Going to go to View, JSON Visualizer, and you should be able to see this. If you can't see it, it's just because I can't zoom in on it. But there's a customer ID, the user ID has the email address, first name, last name is set, sequence got set because we just accidentally set it. But this is everything that we set. We can just let the program complete. The middle tier will continue to run forever, all right, until you tell it to shut down. And that's what you want your service to do. You never want that service to crash because I want to be able to call this from this channel over and over and over again. Maybe I've got a whole bunch of these I want to call. So, but we're going to shut it down. So this is what happens with a web service, and this is how to get a web service working properly. The next video is going to touch on, and it's going to tell you about how to do JavaScript Web Tokens, or JWTs. Thanks for watching the video. Please like and subscribe to the channel. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you now understand how web services work and how easy they are to create. Typically, a .NET developer that has experience with them can set up 20 to 30 of these in a day. Now, that's just the basic crud, but that's a lot of stuff to get done. If you have any questions about something, feel free to drop it in the comments below. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions that anybody has. You're always welcome here in this C# workshop, and as always, have a nice day.